All right, welcome to the Explainer. Today, we're going to talk about the Brazilian frontier state of Mato Grosso, and specifically, how a series of absolutely huge crises in the 19th century basically forged its entire identity. For the huge, really isolated province of Mato Grosso, this wasn't just some what if scenario. No, this was a devastating reality. It kicked off an entire century of turmoil, rebellion, and, in the end, a complete transformation.
Okay, so let's get right into it. The first, and I mean the foundational crisis, was the total collapse of the mining economy. This was the industry that had literally built the entire province from the ground up.
So, what went wrong? Well, it wasn't just one thing. First off, the gold was just gone. The easy stuff, anyway. And the methods they were using to get it out of the ground? Super primitive, totally archaic. They just couldn't get to the deeper stuff. Then you've got the fact that this place was so isolated, which made everything ridiculously expensive. And if that wasn't enough, you had competition from other big mining regions, plus tons of contraband and tax evasion just bleeding the whole system dry. And here's a move that just perfectly sums it all up. In 1835, the government basically packed up its bags, left the old, fading mining town of Ilhabela, and moved the capital to Cuiabá. Why? Because Cuiabá's future was all about agriculture, not gold. Talk about a symbolic shift. This was pretty much the official nail in the coffin for the gold era.
Now, an economic collapse like this, it doesn't just happen in a vacuum, it creates one. The old system was completely shattered, leaving this huge power vacuum. And what rushed in to fill it? Not new, bright opportunities, but really violent political conflict.
And you have to remember what was going on in the rest of Brazil at the time. This was the Regency period. The emperor was just a kid, so you had these regents trying to run the country, and it was a mess. Constant power grabs, political warfare at the national level, and all that chaos, it just poured fuel on the fire in remote places like Mato Grosso.
So all this local tension finally just exploded. The result was an event they called the Rusga. And the name really says it all. It means tumult, disorder. This was a super violent rebellion, and it was organized by the local liberal elites. They were fed up, and they needed a scapegoat. And who did they pick? The Portuguese merchants and administrators who were still clinging to power.
This revolt was quick, but it was absolutely brutal. The rebels stormed the barracks, and then this violent hunt began for the Portuguese. They called them bicudos, which was a slur that packed in all this resentment about their economic power. And here's the really crucial part. This was not some popular uprising for social justice. No way. This was a flat-out, savage power struggle between different factions of the local elite. They were basically fighting over the scraps of a dead economy. It's a stark reminder that on the frontier, independence sometimes just meant one group of powerful people violently replacing another, not a new age of freedom for everyone. Okay, so gold is gone. The political situation is a total mess. What do? The province desperately needed a new way to make money, a new foundation. So let's take a look at what they managed to find to replace that lost glitter of gold. So it turns out there wasn't just one magic answer. There were three, and each one completely reshaped a different part of this huge territory. First up, cattle. Ranching became the new economic backbone out on the plains, and that created this rugged, self-reliant cowboy culture we often think of. Then, down in the south, you had yerba mate. It's a kind of tea. International demand for it was huge, and suddenly, Mato Grosso was plugged back into global markets. And then way up in the north, there was a rubber boom that kicked off this massive new wave of migration, totally changing who was even living there.
But, while the elites are busy fighting over politics and profits, there was a completely different struggle going on, a much deeper one, happening in the shadows of the province.
Yeah, we're talking about enslaved people who were escaping the absolutely horrific conditions on the mines and plantations. They went deep into the frontier and formed their own free communities, which were known as quilombos. And let's be clear, these were not just hideouts. These were organized, self-sufficient societies all built on the radical, powerful idea of freedom. And maybe the most famous of all of them was the Quilombo do Quartere. At its peak, it was estimated to have a population of around 100 people. Now, that might not sound like a lot, but for a remote, defiant community like this, that's a really significant number. And just look at how organized they were. Corte, which was led by the legendary Queen Teresa, was a truly multi-ethnic society. You had Africans, indigenous people, mestizos. They weren't just surviving, they were thriving. They grew their own food, maize, manioc, beans. They developed crafts like weaving. They even had a sophisticated military defense system. This was a powerful, self-governing community that was a direct, living challenge to the entire slave-based system.
So it seems like Mato Grosso is finally starting to find its footing, right? They're building these new economies, but then, bam, a devastating international war lands right on its doorstep, and it threatens to tear everything down all over again. I'm talking about the Paraguayan War. This was the biggest, deadliest war in the history of South America. And for Mato Grosso, this wasn't some far-off conflict they heard about in the news. No. For them, the war started with a direct, overwhelming invasion of their land.
See, the Paraguayan dictator Solano Lopez, he launched what he called a guerra relámpago, a lightning war. In late 1864, his army just swept into the province. And Mato Grosso, it was almost totally undefended. It was a disaster. By January of 1865, they'd captured the key city of Corumba, which basically cut Mato Grosso off from the rest of Brazil entirely. And if you want to understand the impact of this war, just look at what happened to Corumbá. Before the invasion, this city was the province's lifeline. It was a booming port, the link between those fragile new economies and the outside world. After 2 years of occupation, it was left in absolute ruins. This was so much more than a military campaign. It was an absolute catastrophe that shattered the economy and left this deep, permanent scar on the society. So that brings us to the big question, right? You have this crucible of crises, economic collapse, a violent political revolt, and then a devastating war. How on earth did all of this come together to forge a new identity for Mato Grosso? Well, a few things happened. First, the province went all in on its identity as a cattle ranching frontier. This really laid the groundwork for the agricultural powerhouse it would become. Second, and this is kind of ironic, the war, as destructive as it was, forced the Brazilian Empire to finally pay attention to this remote border region. For strategic reasons, they had to integrate it into the rest of the nation. And finally, all this struggle created a people, a society, that was just incredibly resilient, defined by a long history of having to survive all on its own. And, this history of crisis and adaptation, it didn't just stop in the 19th century. Not at all. It laid the very foundation for the agricultural giant that Mato Grosso is today. That whole legacy of resilience, of having to rebuild from scratch, that fierce frontier mentality, you can still see it. It continues to shape the culture, the politics, and the state's absolutely crucial role in Brazil's economy today.